The heavy wooden doors of the Palazzo della Signoria creaked open with deliberate slowness, echoing through the marble corridors like thunder announcing a storm. It was March 15, 1503, and Niccolò Machiavelli stood at the threshold of what would become one of the most crucial lessons in his understanding of power. He had been summoned to witness something extraordinary, the fall of a man who had ruled Florence for nearly 3 decades, brought down not by armies or conspiracies, but by 5 seconds of weakness in front of those he governed. Piero Soderini, the gonfalonier for life of the Florentine Republic, sat behind an ornate desk that seemed to dwarf his increasingly frail figure. The morning light streaming through tall Gothic windows cast long shadows across the room, creating an almost theatrical setting for what Machiavelli would later describe as the precise moment when authority dies. The secretary had arrived early, as was his custom, to observe the daily audience where citizens could present their grievances and petitions to their leader. What unfolded in those morning hours would fundamentally reshape Machiavelli's understanding of power dynamics and lead him to develop what he privately called the doctrine of immediate dominance, a principle so potent that he would later weave it subtly through the prince, though never stating it explicitly. This hidden tactic would become the cornerstone of his political philosophy, yet it remained buried beneath layers of more obvious advice about warfare, alliances, and statecraft. The first petitioner entered the chamber with the confident stride of a merchant who had built his fortune through shrewd negotiations and calculated risks. Giovanni Tornabuoni represented the powerful banking families who formed the economic backbone of Florence, and his presence commanded immediate attention. His silk robes rustled softly as he approached the dais, and every eye in the room followed his measured steps across the marble floor. Machiavelli positioned himself discreetly behind a column, his keen eyes observing every nuance of the interaction that was about to unfold. He had developed an almost supernatural ability to read the subtle currents of power that flowed through such encounters, understanding that true authority was not derived from titles or formal positions, but from something far more primal and immediate. The air itself seemed charged with anticipation as the merchant prepared to speak. "Your Excellence," Tornabuoni began, his voice carrying the practiced authority of someone accustomed to commanding attention in boardrooms and marketplaces, "the new taxation proposals threaten to strangle the very lifeblood of our commerce. The banking houses have discussed this matter extensively, and we find ourselves united in opposition to measures that will drive capital from our beloved Florence to the welcoming arms of Venice and Genoa." The words hung in the air like incense, heavy with implication and barely concealed threat. This was not merely a petition, it was a challenge to the fundamental authority of the state, delivered with the polished courtesy that made it all the more dangerous. Machiavelli watched as other observers in the chamber shifted almost imperceptibly, their attention focused not on the merchant's words, but on something far more critical: how their leader would respond in the first moments after being challenged. Soderini's response came after what seemed like an eternity but was actually no more than 3 seconds of silence. His hands, which had been resting confidently on the arms of his chair, began to fidget almost imperceptibly with the golden tassels of his ceremonial sash. His eyes, rather than meeting Tornabuoni's direct gaze, flickered momentarily to the assembled crowd of observers, as if seeking support or measuring their reaction. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a subtle tremor that betrayed uncertainty beneath the formal words of authority. "The taxation measures have been carefully considered by the Signoria," Soderini replied, but his tone lacked the immediate force that such a challenge demanded. "We shall, of course, review the concerns of our esteemed banking community and consider modifications that might address their legitimate interests while serving the greater good of the Republic." In those 5 seconds between challenge and response, Machiavelli witnessed what he would later describe as the precise moment when a prince ceases to be a prince. The secretary's sharp mind immediately grasped the significance of what he had observed. Authority, he realized, was not a fixed quality inherent in position or title, but rather a dynamic force that required constant renewal and demonstration. Like a flame that must be fed continuously or risk extinction, political power demanded immediate and decisive assertion whenever it faced challenge. The reaction in the chamber was immediate and profound, though expressed through the subtle language of courtly behavior rather than open rebellion. Tornabuoni's posture straightened almost imperceptibly, his chin lifting slightly as he sensed the weakness in his opponent's response. Other observers exchanged meaningful glances, their earlier deference beginning to transform into something approaching calculation. The delicate ecosystem of respect and fear that sustained political authority had been disrupted, and predators were beginning to sense opportunity. Machiavelli understood that he was witnessing more than a simple policy disagreement. He was observing the fundamental dynamics that govern all human relationships involving power and submission. The merchant had not merely presented a complaint about taxation, he had thrown down a gauntlet, testing whether the man who claimed authority over Florence possessed the immediate strength to maintain that claim. Soderini's hesitation, brief though it was, had provided the answer that everyone in the room needed to know. The remainder of the audience proceeded according to the established protocols of Florentine governance, but the underlying dynamic had shifted irrevocably. Subsequent petitioners approached with subtly increased boldness, their deference now tinged with the confidence of those who had detected weakness in their nominal superior. Each interaction built upon the previous one, creating a cascade effect that would ultimately prove impossible to reverse. As the morning progressed, Machiavelli continued his silent observation, his mind racing to understand the deeper principles that governed what he was witnessing. He began to see that authority operated according to laws as precise and predictable as those that governed the movement of celestial bodies. Just as a planet's gravitational pull could be calculated and measured, political power followed patterns that could be studied, understood, and ultimately mastered by those with sufficient insight and discipline. The secretary realized that most political thinkers focused their attention on the formal structures of government, constitutions, laws, institutional frameworks, while ignoring the far more fundamental question of how authority actually functioned in the immediate, personal encounters between rulers and the ruled. These brief moments of interaction, lasting only seconds, determined whether commands would be obeyed, whether respect would be maintained, and whether power would continue to flow from its claimed source. By the time the morning audience concluded, Soderini's position had been fatally compromised, though the full consequences would not become apparent for several weeks. The Gonfalonier continued to issue orders and make pronouncements, but the invisible foundation that gave those orders their force had been damaged beyond repair. Like a building whose structural integrity had been compromised by a seemingly minor crack, the entire edifice of his authority would soon come crashing down. Machiavelli left the Palazzo della Signoria that day with his mind buzzing with new understanding. He had discovered something that would fundamentally transform his approach to political analysis, the recognition that power was not a static possession but a dynamic performance that required constant renewal. More importantly, he had identified the precise mechanism through which this performance succeeded or failed, the crucial first moments of any encounter where authority was challenged or tested. The young secretary spent the following days walking the streets of Florence, observing countless interactions between masters and servants, merchants and customers, priests and parishioners, parents and children. In each case, he found confirmation of his new insight: authority was established, maintained, or lost in the first few seconds of any encounter where it was put to the test. Those who understood this principle and could apply it consistently would rise to power and maintain it. Those who remained ignorant of its operation would inevitably find themselves overthrown by those who grasped its significance. Part 2. The Architecture of Immediate Command. 3 weeks after witnessing Soderini's fatal hesitation, Machiavelli found himself in the private study of Lorenzo de' Medici the Younger, a man who had recently returned to Florence with ambitions to restore his family's former dominance over the Republic. The contrast between this encounter and the previous one could not have been more stark, and it provided the secretary with an opportunity to observe the positive application of the principles he was beginning to understand. Lorenzo stood with his back to the door as Machiavelli entered, apparently absorbed in examining a detailed map of Tuscany that covered most of the wall behind his desk. The silence stretched for several heartbeats before the Medici heir turned to acknowledge his visitor, and, in that moment, Machiavelli recognized that he was witnessing a masterful demonstration of the very principles he had been contemplating. The delay was not accidental, it was a calculated assertion of dominance that established the hierarchy between them before a single word was spoken. "Secretary Machiavelli," Lorenzo said finally, his voice carrying the quiet confidence of someone who had never doubted his right to command others. "Your reputation for insight into the mechanics of statecraft precedes you. I trust you have come to offer counsel that will prove as valuable as your observations of recent events in the Signoria." The words themselves were courteous, even deferential, but their delivery carried an unmistakable undertone of command. Lorenzo had managed to acknowledge Machiavelli's expertise while simultaneously making it clear that such expertise was expected to serve the Medici interests. More importantly, he had done so immediately and, without apparent effort, demonstrating the kind of natural authority that Soderini had so conspicuously lacked. Machiavelli studied the young nobleman with the intensity of a philosopher examining a particularly fascinating specimen. Lorenzo possessed what the secretary was beginning to think of as command presence, an immediate and instinctive ability to establish dominance in any interaction. This was not merely a matter of noble birth or inherited position. Many aristocrats lacked this quality entirely and found themselves manipulated by supposedly inferior servants and advisors. Rather, it seemed to be a combination of specific behaviors and attitudes that could be learned and practiced by those with sufficient understanding and discipline. "Your Excellence speaks truly," Machiavelli replied, carefully modulating his own response to acknowledge the established hierarchy while maintaining his dignity as a representative of the Republic. Recent events have indeed provided instructive examples of how authority operates in practice, rather than merely in theory. Lorenzo's eyes sharpened at this oblique reference to Soderini's difficulties, and Machiavelli saw an opportunity to begin testing his new understanding of power dynamics. The next few minutes would reveal whether the Medici heir possessed not only natural authority but also the intellectual sophistication to understand the principles that governed its operation. "The nature of authority," Machiavelli continued, "appears to be far more dynamic and fragile than most political theorists acknowledge. It requires constant demonstration and renewal, particularly in moments when it faces direct challenge. Those who fail to understand this find themselves wondering how their seemingly secure positions can collapse with such surprising speed." The secretary watched Lorenzo's reaction carefully, noting the almost imperceptible nod of recognition that suggested familiarity with such concepts. This was not merely theoretical discussion for the Medici heir, it was practical knowledge essential for his family's political survival and eventual restoration to power. The conversation that followed would prove to be one of the most significant in Machiavelli's intellectual development, as it provided him with the opportunity to articulate and refine his emerging understanding of immediate dominance. "You speak of authority as if it were a performance," Lorenzo observed, moving to pour wine from an ornate silver pitcher into 2 crystal goblets. Even this simple action was performed with the kind of natural grace that reinforced his social superiority without appearing calculated or artificial. "But surely there are more fundamental sources of power: wealth, military force, legal legitimacy, divine sanction?" Machiavelli accepted the offered wine with a slight bow that acknowledged Lorenzo's courtesy while maintaining appropriate formality. The question revealed sophisticated political thinking, and the secretary recognized that he was dealing with someone who could genuinely appreciate the subtleties of his emerging theory. "All of those sources of power are indeed important," Machiavelli replied, "but they operate through the medium of immediate personal interaction. Wealth must be displayed and demonstrated to be effective, military force must be credibly threatened or actually applied, legal authority must be asserted and accepted, divine sanction must be claimed and recognized. In every case, the final moment of truth comes down to a direct encounter between one human being who claims authority and another who must decide whether to acknowledge that claim." Lorenzo settled into a high-backed chair upholstered in rich Florentine silk, his posture conveying relaxed confidence while maintaining an alertness that suggested complete attention to the conversation. Machiavelli noted how even these small details contributed to the overall impression of natural authority. Nothing was left to chance, yet nothing appeared calculated or artificial. "Then, you would argue," Lorenzo said thoughtfully, "that the ultimate foundation of political power lies not in abstract principles or institutional structures, but in the immediate psychological dynamic between ruler and subject at the moment when authority is tested?" The question demonstrated exactly the kind of sophisticated understanding that Machiavelli had hoped to find. He realized that he was speaking with someone who not only grasped the theoretical implications of his insight but also possessed the practical experience to appreciate its significance for real political action. Precisely, Machiavelli confirmed, his excitement at finding such a receptive audience barely contained beneath his diplomatic composure. "And this dynamic operates according to principles that can be studied, understood, and mastered. Those who learn to control these crucial first moments of interaction will find that all other aspects of power become far more manageable." What followed was an extended discussion that lasted well into the afternoon, during which Machiavelli found himself articulating ideas that had been forming in his mind since witnessing Soderini's downfall. Lorenzo proved to be not merely an attentive listener but an active collaborator, contributing insights from his own experience that helped refine and develop the emerging theory. Together, they identified what Machiavelli would later privately refer to as the 4 pillars of immediate dominance, the essential elements that must be present in any successful assertion of authority. The first pillar was physical presence, the ability to command attention through posture, movement, and spatial positioning that immediately established hierarchy. Lorenzo demonstrated this naturally, but Machiavelli began to understand that it could be learned and practiced by anyone willing to study its components. The second pillar was vocal command, not merely the content of what was said, but the tone, pace, and timing that carried the real message about who held power in the interaction. Soderini had failed this test completely when he allowed uncertainty to creep into his voice, while Lorenzo consistently spoke with the quiet confidence of someone who expected to be obeyed. The third pillar was temporal control, the ability to dictate the rhythm and pace of interaction, determining when to speak and when to remain silent, when to act and when to wait. This was perhaps the most subtle aspect of authority, yet Machiavelli was beginning to see that it was also one of the most powerful tools available to those who understood its operation. The fourth and final pillar was emotional steadiness, the capacity to maintain complete composure regardless of the nature of the challenge being faced. This was what had ultimately destroyed Soderini, not the weakness of his position or the strength of his opponents, but his inability to remain emotionally steady when his authority was tested. As their conversation progressed, Machiavelli realized that Lorenzo was not merely learning these principles but had actually been applying them intuitively throughout their entire interaction. The Medici heir had demonstrated each of the four pillars from the moment the secretary entered his study, creating a masterful display of natural authority that served both as practical demonstration and theoretical confirmation of the ideas they were discussing. The implications of what you describe, Lorenzo observed as their discussion began to wind down, extend far beyond the immediate question of political authority. These same principles would apply to any situation where one person seeks to influence or control another, in commerce, warfare, diplomacy, even personal relationships. Machiavelli nodded enthusiastically, recognizing that his companion had grasped not merely the specific application of these ideas to statecraft, but their fundamental significance for understanding human nature itself. This was the kind of insight that could revolutionize not just political theory, but the entire approach to analyzing social interaction and human behavior. Indeed, the secretary replied. What we have discovered here is not merely a tactical approach to maintaining political power, but a fundamental principle that governs all human relationships involving dominance and submission. Those who master these techniques will find success in every arena of human endeavor. The meeting concluded with Lorenzo extending an invitation for future discussions, an offer that Machiavelli accepted with genuine enthusiasm. He recognized that he had found not merely a powerful political ally, but an intellectual collaborator who could help him develop and refine ideas that might otherwise remain incomplete or poorly understood. Part 3, the eternal principle in motion. The opportunity to witness his theories in action came sooner than Machiavelli had anticipated. Within a month of his conversation with Lorenzo de' Medici, political events in Florence had accelerated to a crisis point that would provide the ultimate test of the principles he had been developing. The secretary found himself in the unique position of being able to observe how the doctrine of immediate dominance operated under the most extreme conditions possible, when the very survival of the state hung in the balance. The crisis began with news that Cesare Borgia, the notorious son of Pope Alexander VI, was marching on Florence with a substantial military force. The Duke Valentino, as he was known, had already conquered much of central Italy through a combination of military skill, political cunning, and what contemporaries described as an almost supernatural ability to inspire fear in his enemies. His approach toward Florence represented the greatest external threat the Republic had faced in decades, and the response of its leadership would determine whether the city-state survived as an independent entity. Machiavelli received orders to accompany the delegation that would meet with Cesare Borgia to negotiate terms that might preserve Florentine independence. The mission was led by Francesco Soderini, brother of the increasingly embattled Gonfalonier, along with several other senior officials whose reputations for diplomatic skill were supposed to provide some hope of success. However, the secretary suspected that the outcome would depend not on formal diplomatic protocols, but on the immediate personal dynamic that would be established in the first moments of encounter with the Duke. The meeting took place in the captured city of Imola, where Cesare had established his temporary court in a massive fortress that dominated the surrounding countryside. Machiavelli and his fellow delegates were escorted through a series of courtyards and corridors designed to impress visitors with the Duke's power and wealth, before finally being admitted to the great hall where their host awaited them. Cesare Borgia stood in the center of the hall, surrounded by his captains and advisors, presenting an image that seemed calculated to embody everything that Florence's merchant princes were not. Where the Florentine delegates wore the somber black robes that signified their republican virtue, the Duke was dressed in brilliant scarlet silk that caught and reflected the light from dozens of candles. Where the Florentines approached with the measured steps of men seeking to negotiate as equals, Cesare remained motionless, forcing his visitors to come to him. The silence stretched for what seemed like an eternity as the Florentine delegation arranged themselves before the Duke's chair, waiting for permission to speak. Machiavelli used this interval to observe every detail of the scene, recognizing that he was witnessing a masterful demonstration of the very principles he had been studying. Cesare was using the 4 pillars of immediate dominance with the skill of someone who understood their operation at the deepest possible level. His physical presence dominated the space through a combination of positioning, costume, and bearing that immediately established his superiority over everyone else in the room. His silence demonstrated temporal control, forcing others to wait on his convenience rather than responding to their expectations. The emotional steadiness he projected suggested a man completely confident in his ability to handle whatever challenges might arise. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the absolute authority of someone who had never doubted his right to command others. "Gentlemen of Florence," Cesare began, his words echoing through the hall with perfect clarity, "you have come to discuss terms for your city's submission to the authority of the Church and its faithful servant. I trust you understand that the time for negotiation as equals has passed, and that what remains is merely the question of how gracefully you will acknowledge the reality of your situation." The statement was delivered not as a threat or ultimatum, but as a simple observation of fact. This was perhaps the most sophisticated application of immediate dominance that Machiavelli had ever witnessed. The Duke was asserting complete authority while making it appear that he was merely acknowledging circumstances that already existed. The psychological effect on the Florentine delegates was immediate and devastating. Francesco Soderini, who had entered the hall with the confidence of an experienced diplomat representing a sovereign state, visibly struggled to maintain his composure in the face of such overwhelming assertion of dominance. His carefully prepared opening remarks, which had been designed to establish Florence's position as an independent republic willing to negotiate reasonable terms, suddenly seemed not merely inadequate but almost absurd. The very foundations of the diplomatic mission had been swept away before the formal negotiations had even begun. "Your Excellence," Soderini began, his voice lacking the firm authority that such circumstances demanded, "the Republic of Florence has always maintained the deepest respect for His Holiness the Pope and seeks only to discuss arrangements that will serve the interests of both the Church and our beloved city." Machiavelli winced inwardly at the weakness evident in his colleague's response. The use of the phrase "Your Excellence" rather than insisting on forms of address appropriate between sovereign equals, the immediate acknowledgement of papal authority, and the defensive tone that suggested Florence was seeking permission rather than negotiating terms, all of these elements revealed that Cesare's opening gambit had achieved exactly the effect he intended. The Duke's response came with the swift precision of a master swordsman delivering a killing blow. "The respect of Florence for the Holy See is indeed commendable," he said, his tone suggesting that he was conferring approval on children who had finally learned proper behavior. "It is this respect that makes it possible for us to discuss arrangements that will ease your city's transition to its proper place within the Papal States, rather than requiring the more direct methods that have proven necessary elsewhere." The threat was implicit but unmistakable, and it was delivered with the kind of casual confidence that suggested the Duke considered the military option not as a desperate last resort, but as a routine administrative procedure. Machiavelli recognized that he was witnessing the application of immediate dominance at its highest level. Cesare was not merely asserting authority over the Florentine delegates, but restructuring the entire framework within which the conversation could take place. What followed was not really a negotiation in any meaningful sense, but rather an extended demonstration of how complete psychological dominance could be used to achieve political objectives without resort to actual violence. Over the course of several hours, the Duke systematically dismantled every argument the Florentine delegates attempted to advance, not through superior logic or more compelling evidence, but through the relentless application of the principles that Machiavelli had been studying. Each time one of the delegates attempted to assert Florence's rights or interests, Cesare responded with a combination of physical presence, vocal authority, temporal control, and emotional steadiness that made their position appear not merely weak but fundamentally misguided. He never raised his voice or resorted to crude intimidation. Instead, he maintained the demeanor of someone patiently explaining obvious truths to people who were being deliberately obtuse. The psychological effect was devastating and cumulative. With each exchange, the Florentine delegates found themselves accepting more and more of Cesari's fundamental premises, until they were essentially negotiating the terms of their own surrender while believing they were still defending their city's independence. By the end of the meeting, they had agreed to conditions that would have seemed completely unacceptable when they entered the hall that morning. Machiavelli left Imola with his understanding of immediate dominance fundamentally transformed. What he had witnessed was not merely the successful application of the principles he had been studying, but their elevation to the level of high art. Cesare Borgia had demonstrated that someone who truly mastered these techniques could achieve almost any objective without resort to crude force or obvious threats. The Duke had conquered Florence as completely as if he had stormed its walls and put its defenders to the sword, yet he had done so using nothing but the power of his immediate personal presence. The secretary spent the journey back to Florence developing what would become his most sophisticated understanding of how authority actually operated in human affairs. The four pillars of immediate dominance, physical presence, vocal command, temporal control, and emotional steadiness, were not merely useful techniques for politicians and military leaders, but fundamental principles that governed all human interaction involving questions of dominance and submission. More importantly, Machiavelli realized that these principles operated according to laws as precise and predictable as those that governed the movement of celestial bodies. Just as an astronomer could calculate the position of planets by understanding gravitational forces, a political theorist could predict the outcome of encounters between rulers and subjects by analyzing how well each party understood and applied the principles of immediate dominance. This insight would ultimately transform Machiavelli's entire approach to political analysis. Rather than focusing primarily on institutional structures, legal frameworks, or abstract theories of governance, he would concentrate on the immediate personal dynamics that determined whether authority was established, maintained, or lost. The Prince, when he eventually wrote it, would be structured around this fundamental insight, though the specific techniques of immediate dominance would remain largely hidden beneath more obvious discussions of military strategy and diplomatic maneuvering. The secretary understood that he had discovered something of enormous practical value, but also something potentially dangerous if it fell into the wrong hands. The ability to manipulate these psychological dynamics could be used not merely to establish legitimate authority, but to create and maintain systems of oppression that served no purpose beyond the aggrandizement of those who wielded power. The ethical implications of his discoveries would continue to trouble him for the rest of his life, even as he recognized their fundamental importance for understanding human nature. Years later, when Machiavelli had occasion to reflect on the trajectory of his intellectual development, he would always return to those crucial encounters in 1503 as the moments when his understanding of political reality underwent its most fundamental transformation. The fall of Piero Soderini, his conversations with Lorenzo de' Medici, and the masterful display of dominance by Cesare Borgia had provided him with the foundational insights that would guide all of his subsequent thinking about power, authority, and human nature. The doctrine of immediate dominance would remain largely hidden in his published works, revealed only through careful analysis of specific examples and recommendations that seemed to focus on other aspects of statecraft. But, for those with eyes to see and minds to understand, the principles were there, embedded in every discussion of how successful princes maintained their authority and why unsuccessful ones found themselves overthrown by seemingly inferior opponents. Machiavelli had discovered that the first 5 seconds of any encounter involving authority truly did make or break the exercise of power. Those who understood this principle and could apply it consistently would rise to positions of influence and maintain them against all challenges. Those who remained ignorant of its operation would find themselves wondering how their seemingly secure positions had collapsed with such devastating speed and completeness. The hidden tactic was never really hidden at all, it was simply so fundamental to human nature that most people failed to recognize its operation even when it was being applied against them. Like the air they breathed or the ground beneath their feet, the principles of immediate dominance were so basic to human interaction that they became invisible through their very ubiquity. But, for those few individuals who developed the insight to perceive these patterns and the discipline to master their application, the rewards were almost unlimited power over their fellow human beings. In the end, Machiavelli's greatest discovery was not any particular political strategy or diplomatic technique, but rather the recognition that authority itself was far more fragile and far more manipulable than anyone had previously understood. The implications of this insight extended far beyond the immediate concerns of Renaissance statecraft, touching on fundamental questions about human nature, social organization, and the possibilities for both liberation and oppression inherent in any system of governance. The first 5 seconds truly did make or break authority, but the deeper truth was that authority itself was nothing more than a collective agreement to accept someone's claim to dominance, an agreement that could be created, maintained, or destroyed through the proper application of psychological principles that remained largely unknown to those who were subject to their operation. This was Machiavelli's hidden tactic, and it would continue to shape the exercise of power for centuries after his death, employed by those who understood its significance and suffered by those who remained ignorant of its existence.